chap looked a bit sheepish and said, I don't know how to tell you this, but I was meant to be the chap who introduced you. Okay. My talk today involves a national obsession at football and asks the question, has money killed the beautiful game? And I think if you were to ask 100 people the question and demand an instant answer, I think 99 out of 100 would say yes, it has. It's not like it used to be. But as usual with questions like this, it's not quite as straightforward as it may be. Because yes, there have been negative aspects of money in the game, but there's also been very positive aspects. So you could ask the question, were football's old days really that good? Again, I think this promotes an emotional response, because for most of us, football is a childhood memory. So we have happy memories of football. This is Nat Lofthouse in just photograph taken in 1958, and sadly he died in Bolton in January this year. And this look typifies the gentleman players of that era. They were hard but fair men, and they received wages just like the man who was driving the bus or working down the line. And they were almost military in appearance, and you couldn't imagine any of them having to take out a private injunction to prevent publication of details about their private life. And a relative of mine, who funny enough repeated the story yesterday over lunch, said that just after the war and into the 50s, he would often see Liverpool players on public transport going to the match, to play in the match. Imagine that now with the stars that we have today. Now, these gentlemen players were seen as role models, just as top players are to this day. And eagle-eyed amongst you would spot a snooker player there, but he would definitely, for those, come into the same category as gentleman player. And these would be very much praised for their off-pitch behaviour as well as their behaviour on the field. Now, I'm wondering whether behaviour and manners are actually a reflection of society as a whole. Despite a contradictory article in the papers only this week, I think most people would feel that manners have declined in the general public as a whole over the last 30 odd years. And so maybe behaviour that we sometimes see on football pitches reflects that. It's possible. But you can't help but think that the vast influx of wages for some of these players hasn't helped when it comes to manners. Now, whilst in nostalgia mode, I couldn't resist these pictures of Gordon Banks being introduced to the cop by the marvellous Bill Shankly, two heroes of mine, of course. And can't mention Shankly without mentioning a few Shankly remarks. Good job the Everton conference chap isn't here, by the way. I noticed he couldn't make it. But Shankly once said to Alan Ball, well, never mind, Alan, at least you'll be playing near a great side. He also said, if Everton were playing at the bottom of my garden, I'd draw the curtains. And my favourite, when Liverpool signed the massive Ron Yates, who you might recall, absolutely huge, Bill Shankly called a press conference and said to the press, you can walk round him if you like, he's a colossus. And said, with Ron Yates at centre-half, we could put Arthur Askey in goal. And another character from these days, of course, was Brian Clough. And we can always remember Cloughie. And that famous interview with the young chap struggling, when Cloughie said to him, young man, you couldn't ask me a difficult question if you tried. And Brooke also eventually said, do any of the players ever disagree with you, Brian? And he said, sometimes they do. So I get them into my office, and then they leave my office a few minutes later, thoroughly understanding that I was right all along. Now, you've got to remember that it was Brian Clough who dropped Larry Lloyd, an ex-Liverpool player, for getting his blazer on the rug. And you might recall that story. And, of course, Liverpool fans used to tease Larry Lloyd when he came to Liverpool about it. But could you possibly imagine that happening these days? And it's very difficult to appreciate what on earth Cloughie would do to a player who refused to come off the bench and play. Now, this is a personal story. I moved with my parents from Merseyside to Essex when I was a teenager, and by chance I was driving around and I ended up in this pub in Tillingham in Essex. It's literally in the middle of nowhere in the marshes there. And I got chatting to the landlord of this pub, and he seemed a really good bloke, and we were having a good time. And a couple of pints and smoking those days, smoking away, chatting. He seemed a bit knowledgeable about football. So where'd you come from, I expect? So we were chatting away. When I got home, I just happened to mention to my father that I'd been chatting to a chap called Neil Franklin, some old geezer, so seems to know football, called Neil Franklin. You went, Neil Franklin? Franklin, he said he's one of the best centre-halves England's ever had. Played for Stoke and England. And what's fascinating about this, by the way, is that he had a disastrous foray over to Colombia, over to Bogota, him and 4 other players. And it was a disaster, it all went wrong. When he came back, he was bought by Hull City for a world record fee for a defender of £25,000. And that's about 3/4 of a day's wage for Yaya Toure at Man City. But he was one of these gentlemen players. He was universally praised for his integrity and honesty and decency. And he looks it too, doesn't he? They look this from military time. I love this picture. It says, on a lighter note, I remember there being quite a lot of fuss because Blackpool had to cancel games because they didn't have under-soil heating. Now, to be honest, when footballers were real men, you just painted the ball orange and got on with it. Look at this. And on another occasion at this ground, the fog was so thick that Liverpool scored at one end. The cop couldn't see who'd scored. Had to sing across to the Anfield Road end who had scored. It was a chap called Tony Hake. So yes, paint the ball orange and get on with it. Now it's interesting that it wasn't just Liverpool that had this camaraderie. It was everyone had this camaraderie. And it's interesting that it's what are deemed, hopefully not insultingly, the smaller clubs now, who tend to have this bond with the players and this same camaraderie, like Stoke and Blackpool. And I don't think it's a coincidence that their managers are not Armani-suited foreign gentlemen who can barely speak the language, but a passionate players and ex-players in England. So it's essential really that they have this bond with the players, and it's the smaller clubs that tend to retain it, I think. Football's got mass appeal, it still has obviously, but it would be ridiculous these days to say it's a working class game. A number of grounds still reside amongst these terraced streets, Anfield being one of them. But it's really getting rarer and rarer, and increasingly, as clubs build huge spaceship-type arenas on greenfield sites outside of their base, city bases, there's going to be less and less ties to the neighbourhoods that used to be associated with the game. And I think you go to places like the JJB or Reebok, and they are fantastic stadiums. But you do feel a little twinge that they're no longer in the communities that they used to serve. But, having said that, just to finish off on that last point, if it's the high streets are having exactly the same problem. It's not a working man's game anymore. You want to go in your car, you want comfort. If you can't park, you don't want to go. So that's where places like JJB and Reebok, hold all the trump cards. Easy to park. Now, remember these two gentlemen, of course, Villa and our dealers. And they joined Spurs in 1978, and foreign players were a real rarity then. It's hard to imagine that. And they just won the World Cup with Argentina, but Keith Birkinshaw signed them for a bargain, £750,000 for both. And they weren't welcomed by everybody. The PFA had a few words to say. They weren't very happy with this. But to be fair, I remember them being very popular. When you think our country went to war with their country, and our soldiers were killed by their country's soldiers, you'd have thought they'd be vilified, and it's the absolute opposite. They were very, very warmly welcomed and thought of for the many years that they were over here in the UK. That's Mr. Sugar, of course, looking younger but just as grumpy as ever. Now, I mentioned Neil Franklin earlier, who in his day went for £25,000, but what would he have made of the record transfer made in January of this year? It went from 30 million the year before to a staggering £225 million. And highlights were the eye-watering 50 million paid by Chelsea for Torres, of course, and the 35 million that Liverpool paid for his replacement at Anfield. And I'll touch a little bit later on how these sums lead to a wage spiral that, frankly, is unsustainable. And there's a recurring theme as well. There's one rule for football and another for the rest of us. When a club goes into receivership, for example, there's special rulings to do with it that mean that the football club itself get paid, and the players get paid, but any other creditors form the back of the queue. And it seems strange that there should be one rule for football and one for another, but there are different bankruptcy rules for football clubs. You might find it troubling because have you ever tried to get out of a mobile phone contract? And yet Andy Carroll just signed a 5-year deal with Newcastle, just strolled over the Pennines to Liverpool and signed another one. It just seems to be one rule for footballers and another for the rest of us. Incidentally, I did hear a Premiership football manager saying the other day that the first that he heard that one of his top players had signed a new contract was when he read it in the papers. And imagine that in the old days. Imagine that, coffee centre. It seems extraordinary. Now, looser ties with the community, coupled with the large numbers of foreign players, have all contributed to less loyalty to individual clubs in the past. And I'm going to mention Torres. Torres may only have been stating the obvious when he declared it was good business sense for him to move to Chelsea. But for the fans he leaves behind, it leaves a bitter taste. And I also think that it's extraordinary that football players have been at the club sometimes for many years and then decide their future lies elsewhere with 20 minutes to go before the transfer deadline, which is what's happened this year to a number of players. They just suddenly decide that they're going to move with 20 minutes to go in the transfer deadline. Absolutely. And when players move for obvious financial reasons, it's hard to see them as loyal sportsmen and easy to see them as mercenaries, really, which can change allegiance at will. And what about loyalty to local communities as well? When Portsmouth went bust, they owed £120 million to creditors. And there were 400 local businesses who were owed money who weren't paid. That's not right. So I think there's a growing gap between the owners, the managers, the players and the fans. It's odd when you think how many times teamwork is mentioned. And here's Dickie again, looking fantastic as usual, as if he's just going to sell you a Ford Cortina. He's on the right as well there, with an unnamed Chelsea forward. Now, there's something reassuring and amateurish about the football presentation in those days. The anchormen, if you call that, were just like mates really. And they didn't let technology get in the way of their presentation. And they didn't let technology get in the way of their presentation because there wasn't any. And if you can recall it, they were on banks of huge 3D screens and so on, massive sky and satellite technology. It was the teleprint. Do you remember the teleprint? And it was as complicated as it got. And remember that halting, dodgy font of the teleprinter across the bottom of the screen? And at any moment, you expected it to show, Allied losses to U-boats in between football results. On the subject of these World Cup decisions, the FIFA's choice to award the 2018 World Cup to Russia caused some controversy, been widely criticised, but it's the decision to award the 2022 World Cup to Qatar that has really put the cat amongst the pigeons. On the face of this is a completely bizarre decision. I mean, to hold the world's premier football competition in a tiny, almost unknown Middle East kingdom. Summer temperatures exceed 135 degrees Fahrenheit, and 1.7 million inhabitants, that's all. And 60% of those are migrant workers. But in Qatar, they've got really excited by this, and the Gulf Times English language newspaper says, and I quote, "A nation's prayers have been answered, the region's demands have been met. Qatar and the Middle East have made history, and as a result, the beautiful game has just got more beautiful." So, are we right to think that? Do we think FIFA's grabbing money in undeserving countries, or is it simply trying to raise soccer's profile in new regions? Now, here's a maligned creature who ranks just below investment bankers and estate agents in the public's affection, the football agent. A recent survey showed that agents across Europe had earned in excess of €200 million last year with transfer deals. So are they the villains of the piece, pushing up wages to unsustainable levels? Well, you could ask the same question about merchant bankers as well, but like most things in life, it's not completely straightforward. I think stereotypes are not true in all cases or all of the time, but there's little doubt that not many footballers are blessed with an intellect to match their sporting prowess. And left to their own devices, they'd fare really badly in negotiating their own terms. When the Legal Services Act comes into full effect next year, by the way, allowing law firms to develop greater business relationships with non-lawyers, in fact that's happening now, isn't it? There's talk of more lawyers becoming football agents. Now there's a marriage made in heaven. I heard recently that football used to be a millionaire's game, but has now become a billionaire's game. And when you look at one of the few old-style owners left, like Dave Whelan, it's hard to disagree. Again, I'm repeating myself, he estimates he spent over £100 million of his own money keeping Wigan athletic. It's quite staggering when you think about it. So does it make you feel more reassured that so much money is pouring into football, or does it appall you that well-loved clubs fall one by one into the clutches of foreign billionaires? Do we lose the history and local ties for them just to become playthings of obscenely rich men? I asked if you'd agree with my opinion, so here it is. I watch football, still love it. Like many, it's in my blood. But I don't love it unreservedly, like I did when I was a kid. I'm not as proud of our national side as I used to be when I was younger either. And I get genuinely upset when our football idols behave in a way that shames themselves, their clubs, and themselves. I think most of us will wistfully remember those gentlemen players and feel they could teach today's footballers a thing or two. So to lighten up, it's a shame to end on a sad note that events make it unavoidable. Just when you thought it wasn't possible for football in the sector to have yet another slip-up, it's bad news, I'm afraid. When it comes to England, the United Kingdom in fact, and football, the words "oh" and "for" and "heaven's sake" or similar are used far too often. And I'm afraid this is again one of those occasions. In fact, earlier this year there was another UK football humiliation to follow on from the Ladies World Cup elimination in France. I'm not kidding, but in Istanbul, we recently been knocked out of the Robot World Cup. The UK's best footballers have followed the example of their human counterparts and bombed out of the World Cup. Our first full team was taking place in the 2011 Robo Cup in Istanbul. Sadly, the four-strong squad representing the UK, based out of Edinburgh University, was knocked out in the group stages. I love the spokesman's comments, by the way. He gushed Capello like, I think we could get there, he said. We could make robots, we could win that game, as all the pieces are there. If we did get that, the result wouldn't be just about football. We could get them to do almost anything. Marvellous. I particularly like, by the way, the frank, I've just missed a penalty look Lampard expression on the robotic. I've come to the end of my talk today, and I hope you've enjoyed listening as much as I've enjoyed your company. And it only remains for me to thank you so much for your time today.